The rain lashed against the window of the small, cramped apartment, a rhythmic drumming that felt like a countdown to a disaster Elena didn't see coming. She sat on the worn-out sofa, her hands instinctively resting on the slight curve of her belly. She was 4 months pregnant, tired but filled with a hope that kept her warm despite the draft. She was waiting for Mark. She had cooked his favorite meal, thinking they would celebrate the sound of their baby's heartbeat they had heard at the clinic earlier that day. But when the door finally swung open, the air in the room didn't fill with warmth. It turned ice cold. Mark didn't take off his coat. He didn't look at the dinner table. He didn't even look at her. He just stood there, his shadow long and jagged against the wall, and uttered the words that would shatter Elena's world into a million jagged pieces. "I'm leaving, Elena, and I'm not coming back." The silence that followed was louder than the thunder outside. In that single breath, the man she had supported through years of struggle, the man she thought was her soulmate, had become a stranger. He wasn't just leaving a marriage. He was abandoning his unborn child for a life he claimed he deserved, a life that didn't include the burden of a family. Elena stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, realizing that the man she loved had been dead long before he walked through that door. Mark's voice was devoid of emotion as he began to pack a suitcase he had hidden in the hallway. Elena stood up, her legs trembling so violently she had to lean against the wall for support. "Mark, what are you saying? The baby! We just heard the heartbeat today. You said we were a team." Mark let out a harsh, dry laugh that made Elena flinch. "A team, Elena. Look at this place. Look at us. I'm tired of the struggle, tired of the bills, and frankly, I'm tired of you. I met someone, Elena, someone who understands that I have potential, someone who doesn't tie me down with cravings and doctor appointments." He finally looked at her, but his eyes were vacant, filled with a cold ambition she didn't recognize. The someone was Sarah, a woman from his office, whose father owned half the commercial real estate in the city. Elena realized then that this wasn't a sudden impulse. It was a calculated escape. He had waited until she was at her most vulnerable to cut the ties. "You're leaving your child for money," Elena whispered, the realization tasting like ash in her mouth. Mark zipped up the suitcase with a final decisive snap. "I'm choosing a future, Elena. You should try it sometime." He walked toward the door without a backward glance. As the door clicked shut, the reality crashed down on her. She was alone. She had no job, having been laid off a month prior, no savings, and a child on the way. She sank to the floor, the cold linoleum biting into her skin, and sobbed until her lungs burned. The betrayal wasn't just about another woman. It was the total erasure of the 5 years they had spent building a life together. He had traded her soul for a shiny car and a penthouse view. The following weeks were a blur of shadows. Elena moved into a tiny, damp basement apartment she could barely afford. She sold what little jewelry she had to pay for prenatal vitamins and rent. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw a ghost, pale, thin, and broken. The world felt like a predatory place. She applied for dozens of jobs, but the visible bump in her midsection seemed to be a red flag for employers. She felt discarded, like a piece of old furniture left on the curb. She spent her nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how a person could go from being someone's everything to being an inconvenience, to be discarded. But amidst the darkness, a tiny flutter in her womb reminded her that she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. That tiny life was the only thing keeping her from drifting away entirely. One afternoon, while sitting on a park bench counting her last few dollars, an elderly woman sat beside her. The woman looked at Elena's weary face and then at her pregnant belly. "The darkest hour is just before the dawn, dear," the woman said softly. Elena smiled bitterly. "I think my sun has set for good." The woman patted her hand. "The sun never sets for good. It just moves to the other side so you can see the stars." Elena didn't believe her then. She felt like she was drowning in an ocean of indifference. She didn't know that miles away in a glass tower that touched the clouds, a man named Julian was looking at a file that would change everything. She didn't know that her story was about to take a turn that would make Mark's betrayal look like a footnote in a much grander epic. Life continued to test Elena's resolve. By her 7th month, she had found a meager job cleaning offices at night. It was a grueling work for a pregnant woman, but she did it with a grim determination. One evening, she was assigned to the top floor of the Sterling Heights building, the headquarters of a global tech conglomerate. She was exhausted, her back aching and her feet swollen. As she mopped the marble floors of the executive wing, she didn't notice the man standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city lights. When her mop bucket hit a desk with a loud clatter, she gasped, clutching her stomach. "I'm so sorry, I didn't think anyone was still here," she stammered, her face flushing with embarrassment. The man turned around. He was younger than she expected, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an aura of quiet power that seemed to vibrate in the air. This was Julian Sterling, the billionaire founder of the company. He didn't look angry. He looked concerned, Ed. "You shouldn't be doing this kind of work in your condition," he said, his voice a deep, resonant calm. Elena straightened her back, her pride stinging. "I do what I have to do to survive, sir. I'll be out of your way in a moment." She turned to leave, but a sudden sharp pain in her abdomen made her stumble. Julian was across the room in seconds, catching her before she hit the floor. "Easy," he said, guiding her to a plush leather chair. "When was the last time you ate? When was the last time you rested?" Elena looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "It doesn't matter." Julian knelt in front of her, ignoring the expensive fabric of his suit. "It matters to me. No one should be pushed to this limit." He called his assistant and ordered a meal to be brought up immediately. For the first time in months, someone was looking at Elena not as a liability or a victim, but as a human being worthy of care. As she ate the food he provided, Julian listened. He didn't interrupt, as she told him at first reluctantly, then in a flood of words about Mark, the abandonment and the struggle to keep her head above water. Julian watched her as she spoke. He saw the fire in her eyes that even exhaustion couldn't quench. He saw a woman who had been broken, but refused to stay down. "My mother was in a similar position," Julian said quietly after she finished. "She worked 3 jobs to put me through school. I spent my life building this empire so that I could ensure no woman ever had to suffer like she did. But I see now that there is still so much work to do." He stood up and looked at her. "I don't want you to clean these floors anymore, Elena. I want you to help me run the foundation that supports women in your position. You have the lived experience, the grit, and clearly the heart." Elena was stunned. "You're offering me a job because you feel sorry for me." Julian shook his head. "I don't offer jobs out of pity. I offer them out of potential. You survived a betrayal that would have ended most people. You are still standing. It is the kind of person I want on my team. I'll provide you with a place to stay, medical care, and a salary that reflects your value. All I ask is that you never look back." Elena looked at him, searching for a catch, but she saw only sincerity. In that moment, the weight she had been carrying for months began to lift. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the recognition of her worth. The transition was like a dream. Julian moved her into a beautiful apartment near the office and assigned her the best doctors. But more importantly, he mentored her. He saw her sharp mind and her natural ability to organize and lead. Under his guidance, Elena began to transform. She studied late into the night, learning the intricacies of philanthropy and business management. She wasn't just a charity case. She was becoming a force to be reckoned with. Her beauty, which had been dimmed by sorrow, began to radiate with a new fierce confidence. She was no longer the girl who had been dumped in a rainy apartment. She was becoming the woman she was always meant to be. As her due date approached, Julian was there for every milestone. He wasn't just a boss. He became her closest confidant. He saw the strength she displayed during her labor, a strength that resulted in the birth of a beautiful baby boy she named Leo. When she held Leo for the first time, Elena realized that Mark's departure wasn't a tragedy, it was a clearance. He had cleared the path for a life she could never have imagined. She looked at Julian, who was holding Leo with a tenderness that moved her to tears, and she knew that her journey was far from over. She was wealthy, she was powerful, and for the first time in her life, she was truly free. 2 years passed, and Elena was barely recognizable as the woman who had once scrubbed floors in the dark. She was now the director of the Sterling Foundation, a position that placed her among the most influential women in the city. Her face graced the covers of business magazines, not just for her beauty, which had matured into something elegant and commanding, but for her revolutionary approach to social welfare. She had turned her pain into a blueprint for empowerment. She moved with a grace that came from self-assurance, her wardrobe filled with tailored suits and silk that reflected her status. But inside, her heart remained focused on one thing: providing the best life for Leo. Leo was a bright, happy toddler who knew nothing of the cold basement or the father who didn't want him. To Leo, the world was a place of love and security, largely because of the man he called Papa Julian. Over the 2 years, Julian and Elena's professional bond had deepened into a profound love. It wasn't a hurried romance born of necessity, but a slow-burning fire built on mutual respect and shared values. Julian loved Leo as his own, and Elena had found in Julian a partner who didn't want to diminish her, but to see her shine. They had married in a private ceremony on a cliffside in Italy, a day that felt like the final seal on Elena's old life. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Mark's life had taken a very different turn. The future he had chosen with Sarah had turned out to be a golden cage that quickly turned to lead. Sarah's father was a tyrant who controlled every aspect of Mark's career, and Sarah herself was fickle and demanding. Mark found himself living a life of superficial luxury, surrounded by people who looked down on his humble beginnings. The real estate market had taken a downturn, and Sarah's father's empire was crumbling under the weight of bad investments and legal scandals. Mark was no longer the rising star. He was a liability in a sinking ship. He began to see Elena's face everywhere, on billboards in the news, on social media. At first, he couldn't believe it was the same woman. He told himself it was a fluke, that she must have tricked a billionaire into taking care of her. But as he watched her interviews, he saw the way she spoke with authority and intelligence. He saw the way she looked radiant, powerful, and untouchable. He felt a gnawing sense of regret, though he told himself it was just nostalgia. He compared his current life, filled with arguments and debt, to the image of Elena's success, and the bitterness began to poison him. One evening, Mark sat in his dimly lit office, looking at a magazine featuring Elena and Julian at a gala. They looked perfect. In the corner of one photo, he saw a small boy with dark hair and a familiar tilt to his chin. His heart skipped a beat. That was his son, a son he had never met, a son who was being raised by a man who had everything Mark wanted. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had traded his own flesh and blood for a seat at a table that was now being taken away from him. He decided then that he had to see her. He convinced himself that he could make things right, that Elena would surely want the father of her child back, now that he had learned his lesson. He began to stalk her schedule, looking for an opportunity to catch her alone. He ignored the fact that he had ignored her pleas for help years ago. He ignored the fact that he had left her with nothing. In his mind, he was still the hero of the story, a man who had made a mistake, but deserved a second chance because of his connection to her. He didn't realize that the Elena he knew was gone. The woman he was chasing was a stranger, one who had forged herself in the fire of his betrayal. Elena, meanwhile, was preparing for the largest fundraiser the foundation had ever hosted. She was at the peak of her career and her personal life. She felt a sense of peace she had never known. She was aware of Mark's downfall. The business world was small after all, but she felt nothing but a faint, distant pity. He was a ghost from a past life, a lesson she had learned and moved on from. She had no idea that the ghost was about to manifest in the middle of her bright new reality. thinking he could still haunt her. On the night of the gala, Elena stood in front of the mirror, wearing a gown of midnight blue that shimmered like the evening sky. Julian came up behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "You look spectacular," he whispered. Elena smiled, leaning back against him. "I feel spectacular," she replied. She wasn't thinking about the past. She was thinking about the future they were building together. But, as she stepped out of her limousine at the venue, a shadow moved from behind a pillar. A voice she hadn't heard in years called out her name. A voice that sent a shiver of disgust down her spine. "Elena, Elena, wait." It was Mark. Elena froze for a split second, the sound of that voice acting like a cold needle pricking her skin. Mark stepped out into the light of the gala's entrance, looking weathered and desperate. Gone was the polished, arrogant man who had walked out on her. In his place stood someone who looked like he had been losing a long fight with the world. His suit was expensive, but sat poorly on his frame, and his eyes were bloodshot. Julian felt Elena's tension, and immediately stepped closer, his arm sliding protectively around her waist. He didn't need to be told who this was. The air between the two men crackled with an unspoken hostility. Mark looked at Julian with a mixture of envy and fear, then turned his gaze back to Elena, trying to force a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Elena, you look incredible. I've been trying to reach you. We need to talk. It's about us and about our son." The mention of Leo sent a jolt of protective fury through Elena. She straightened her posture, her eyes turning into chips of blue ice. "There is no us, Mark. There hasn't been an us since the night you packed your bags and left me on the floor of a basement apartment. And as for my son, you don't get to speak his name." Her voice was calm, but it held a cutting edge that silenced the nearby whispers of the arriving guests. Mark took a step forward, his hands raised in a pleading gesture. "I made a mistake, Elena. I was young. I was pressured. I didn't know what I was doing. But seeing you like this, seeing how well you've done, it made me realize that I belong with you. We're a family, Elena. That boy needs his biological father." Julian's grip on Elena's waist tightened slightly, not out of insecurity, but as a silent signal that he was ready to intervene. "Mr. Woods, I believe," Julian said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low, controlled tone. "You have a very distorted definition of family. A father is someone who provides, protects, and stays. You are a donor who walked away when the going got tough. My wife has requested that you leave, and I suggest you do so before my security team makes it a matter of public record." Mark's face flushed a deep, angry red. "This doesn't concern you, Sterling. This is between me and the mother of my child. Elena, look at me. You can't tell me you've forgotten everything we had. All those years, all those dreams. Don't let this man buy your loyalty." The sheer audacity of his words made Elena want to laugh, but the laughter would have been hollow. "You think Julian bought me?" Elena stepped forward, moving out of the safety of Julian's arm to face Mark head-on. "Julian saw my worth when I was wearing a janitor's uniform and touring your child alone. He invested in my soul, not just my bank account. You didn't leave because you were pressured, Mark. You left because you are a coward who thought money was more important than love. And now that your future has fallen apart, you've come crawling back, looking for a lifeboat. I am not your lifeboat. I am the storm that you're not prepared for." Julian signaled to the security guards, who stepped in with practiced efficiency. They blocked Mark's path as Elena and Julian turned their backs on him. "This isn't over, Elena," Mark shouted as he was led away. "You can't keep my son from me. I have rights." Elena didn't flinch. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the expensive lilies decorating the foyer and the comforting woody scent of Julian's cologne. The encounter had been a test, and she had passed it. As they walked into the ballroom, the music swelling to greet them, she felt a final tether to her past snap. She was no longer defined by the man who left. She was defined by the woman who stayed and conquered. The peace Elena felt after the gala was short-lived. True to his word, Mark didn't disappear. A week later, a legal notice arrived at the Sterling estate. Mark was suing for visitation rights and demanding a re-evaluation of the financial arrangements, claiming he had been under duress when they separated. It was a blatant attempt at extortion wrapped in the guise of parental longing. Mark's lawyers, a bottom-tier firm specializing in high-profile shakedowns, began leaking stories to the tabloids. They painted a picture of a grieving father who had been cruelly separated from his child by a cold-hearted billionaire and an ambitious woman who traded her past for a paycheck. Elena sat in Julian's study, the tabloid headlines spread out on the mahogany desk. "He's trying to drag my name through the mud," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and rage. "He knows he can't win, so he's trying to destroy what I've built." Julian walked over and stood behind her, massaging her shoulders. "He's desperate, Elena. Desperate people use desperate measures. But he has forgotten one very important thing. We have the truth, and we have the resources to ensure the truth is the only thing that matters in that courtroom." Julian had already hired the best family law team in the country. He wasn't just fighting for Elena. He was fighting for the sanctity of the home they had built together. The legal battle became a spectacle. Mark appeared on local talk shows playing the victim, wearing a cheap suit and a practiced expression of sorrow. He talked about how he missed the birth of his son due to misunderstandings, and how he only wanted to make things right. He never mentioned the woman he had left Elena for, or the fact that he hadn't contributed a single cent to Leo's upbringing. Elena, on the advice of her lawyers, remained silent. She focused on her work and on Leo, keeping the boy shielded from the media circus. But internally, the stress was taking a toll. She started having nightmares again. The rain, the basement, the sound of the door closing. The day of the first hearing arrived. The courthouse was swarmed with photographers. Elena walked in, flanked by Julian and her legal team, looking like a queen going to war. She wore a sharp charcoal gray suit, her hair pulled back in a sleek bun. Mark was already there, sitting with his lawyers trying to catch her eye. When they were called before the judge, Mark's lawyer launched into a passionate plea about the sacred bond between a biological father and his son. He argued that Elena had manipulated the situation to alienate the child from his father. Elena sat perfectly still, her face a mask of calm, though her heart was pounding against her ribs. When it was Elena's turn to testify, she didn't look at the cameras or the gallery. She looked directly at the judge. She didn't talk about her success or her wealth. She talked about the night Mark left. She produced the journals she had kept during her pregnancy, journals filled with her fears, her hunger, and her prayers for her child's survival. She produced bank records showing her balance of $3 on the day Leo was born, and then her lawyer played a recording. It was a voicemail Mark had left her shortly after he moved in with Sarah, a recording she had saved on an old cloud account. In the recording, Mark's voice was unmistakable. "Don't ever contact me again, Elena. That kid isn't my problem. I have a new life now, and you're just a mistake I'm fixing. Good luck with the struggle." The courtroom went silent. Mark's face drained of color. The grieving father persona shattered instantly. Elena's voice was steady as she finished her testimony. "I am not keeping a father from his son," she said. "I am protecting my son from a stranger who only sees him as a golden ticket. A father is more than a DNA match. A father is the man who wakes up at 200 a.m. to soothe a fever. A father is the man who teaches a child how to walk and how to be kind. My son already has a father, and his name is Julian Sterling." The judge leaned back, looking at Mark with visible disdain. The tide had turned, and it was turning fast. Outside the courtroom, the mood of the press changed instantly. The victim was now the villain. Mark tried to push through the crowd, but the reporters who had once championed him were now shouting questions about his abandonment and his lies. He looked small, pathetic, and utterly defeated. Julian took Elena's hand as they walked to their car. "It's almost over," he whispered. But Elena knew that for Mark, The nightmare was just beginning. He had tried to play a game with people who had nothing to lose but their integrity, and he had underestimated the power of a woman who had already survived the worst he could do. Despite the disastrous hearing, Mark made one last desperate attempt. He knew the legal route was failing, so he tried to appeal to Elena's mercy, or what he thought was her weakness. He showed up at the gates of their estate on a Sunday morning looking disheveled and broken. He didn't bring lawyers this time. He just stood there until the security guard notified Elena. Against Julian's better judgment, Elena decided to meet him at the gate. She wanted this to be the final chapter. She wanted to look him in the eye one last time and see that there was nothing left to fear. "What do you want, Mark?" she asked, standing behind the wrought iron gates. Mark looked up, his eyes glassy. "I'm going to lose everything, Elena. Sarah's father is in jail and the bank is seizing my car. I have nothing. I know I messed up. I know I was a monster. But please, for the sake of the love we once had, help me. I don't even need to see Leo. Just give me enough to get back on my feet. You have millions, Elena. What's a few thousand to you?" The truth finally came out. It was never about the child. It was never about making amends. It was about a handout. Elena felt a strange sense of clarity. She looked at Mark and didn't see the man she had once loved, nor did she see a powerful enemy. She saw a hollow man, a man who had built his life on the shifting sands of greed and had nothing to hold on to when the storm came. "The love we once had died the night you left," she said softly. "You didn't just leave me, Mark. You tried to erase me. You didn't care if I lived or died, or if your son had a roof over his head. You only care about yourself. And that is why you will always have nothing, no matter how much money you have." Mark's desperation turned to a fleeting spark of his old arrogance. "You think you're so much better than me? You just got lucky you found a rich guy to save you. If it weren't for Sterling, you'd still be cleaning toilets." Elena smiled, and it was a smile of pure earned confidence. "Julian didn't save me. Mark, he gave me the tools, but I did the work. I saved myself. I worked while you were playing house with a socialite. I studied while you were trying to brown-nose your way to the top. I am where I am because I am strong. You are where you are because you are weak." She turned to walk away, but Mark grabbed the bars of the gate, his voice cracking. "Elena, please, I have nowhere else to go. I'm your son's father." Elena stopped and turned back. "No, Mark, you are his past. Julian is his present and his future. My son will grow up knowing what a real man looks like. He will grow up knowing that loyalty is worth more than gold, and that a person's character is their true wealth. He will never even know your name if I can help it. To him, you are just a ghost story about what happens when a man loses his soul." She walked back toward the house where she could see Julian and Leo playing on the lawn. Leo was laughing, running toward Julian with his arms wide open. Julian caught him and swung him into the air, the two of them silhouetted against the bright morning sun. It was a picture of a life that Mark could have had if he had been a better man. But he had traded it for a shadow, and now the shadow was all he had left. Elena didn't look back as the gates clicked shut, a sound that echoed like the final beat of a long, painful heart. Inside the house, Elena joined her family. She sat on the grass next to Julian, who took her hand and kissed it. "Is it done?" he asked. "It's done," she replied. The weight was gone. The past was finally buried. She looked at Leo, who was now busy inspecting a ladybug on a leaf, and felt a surge of overwhelming gratitude. Her journey had been long and filled with thorns, but it had led her to this garden. She had been betrayed, abandoned and belittled, but she had risen. She was Elena Sterling, a woman of substance, a mother of strength, and a wife of a man who truly saw her. The story of the girl in the basement was over. The story of the queen had just begun. The rejection at the gates of the Sterling estate was the final nail in the coffin of Mark's pride. He stood there for a long time, staring at the grand house that represented everything he had thrown away. The silence of the suburbs, felt heavy mocking him with the sounds of a life he could no longer touch. Over the next few months, Mark's life disintegrated at an agonizing pace. Without the protection of Sarah's father's name, he was a nobody in a city that thrived on connections. He tried to apply for mid-level management positions, but his reputation preceded him. The story of the man who abandoned his pregnant wife only to sue her for money once she became successful had become a cautionary tale in the business circles. Headhunters wouldn't return his calls, and former colleagues suddenly found themselves too busy to meet for coffee. He was a pariah, a ghost haunting the streets of a city that had moved on without him. Mark was forced to move from his luxury apartment into a cramped windowless studio in a part of town he used to avoid. The irony was not lost on him. He was now living in a place very similar to the one he had left Elena in, but without the hope or the love that she had once provided. He spent his nights drinking cheap whiskey and scrolling through social media, torturing himself with photos of Elena's success. He saw her opening new schools, speaking at international forums, and always in the candid shots looking at Julian with a devotion that once belonged to him. Every time he saw a picture of Leo, his heart twisted with a toxic mix of regret and resentment. He tried to tell himself that he was the victim of a grand conspiracy, that Julian had brainwashed her. But in the quiet hours of the morning, the truth was unavoidable. He had made a choice, and this was the consequence. Desperation drove him to one last act of insanity. He reached out to a fringe tabloid journalist offering to sell exclusive dark secrets about the Sterling Foundation's inner workings. He spent days fabricating stories of financial mismanagement and personal scandals, hoping to stir up enough trouble to force a settlement. He thought he was being clever, but he was playing a game against a man who owned the board. Julian's intelligence network caught wind of the meeting before the ink was even dry on the journalist's notes. Instead of a payoff, Mark was met by a legal team that didn't just threaten him. They presented him with a mountain of evidence of his own past fraudulent dealings within Sarah's father's company dealings he thought were buried. Julian's lead attorney, a man with a voice like cold gravel, sat across from Mark in a sterile meeting room. "Mr. Woods, you have a choice. You can sign this non-disclosure agreement and this permanent restraining order disappearing from my clients' lives forever. Or you can spend the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary for the embezzlement you committed 3 years ago. We have the wire transfers, we have the signatures. My client doesn't want your money, he wants your absence." Mark looked at the documents, his hands shaking. He realized then that Julian hadn't just been protecting Elena. He had been holding a sword over Mark's head the entire time, waiting to see if he would cross the line. The game was over. Mark signed the papers, his hand trembling so much the signature was barely legible. He walked out into the sunlight, a free man technically, but a prisoner of his own failures. While Mark was sinking into obscurity, Elena was reaching new heights. The legal victory and the final disappearance of her ex-husband brought a sense of closure that allowed her to focus entirely on her mission. She didn't just want to give money to women in need. She wanted to change the systems that made them vulnerable in the first place. She launched a global initiative called the Phoenix Project, which provided legal aid, vocational training, and childcare for single mothers. She became a symbol of resilience, a woman who had walked through fire and come out not just unburned but forged into steel. Her speeches were no longer just about philanthropy. They were about the power of the human spirit to redefine itself after betrayal. One morning, Elena sat in her office, looking at a map of the new centers they were opening across Europe and Asia. Julian walked in carrying a cup of her favorite tea. He didn't say anything. He just stood by the window, watching her work. Elena looked up and smiled. "What is it?" she asked. Julian walked over and leaned against her desk. "I was just thinking about the first time I saw you. You were so tired, Elena. Your shoulders were slumped, and you looked like you were carrying the weight of the world. And now look at you. You're not just carrying your own world. You're building worlds for thousands of other people. I've never been more proud of anyone in my life." Elena stood up and walked into his arms. I couldn't have done it without the space you gave me to breathe, Julian. You didn't save me. You gave me the permission to save myself." They stood there in the quiet of the office, a partnership built on a foundation that no storm could shake. Their love had grown into something profound, a quiet, steady flame that didn't need grand gestures or public displays to prove its worth. Julian had shown her that a real man's strength isn't in his ability to dominate or walk away, but in his capacity to support and remain. He was the anchor that allowed her to sail into the unknown, knowing she always had a safe harbor to return to. As the years passed, Leo grew into a bright, empathetic child. He had Julian's calm temperament and Elena's fierce intelligence. He lived in a world of privilege, but Elena made sure he understood the value of hard work and the importance of helping those less fortunate. Every summer she took him to the foundation centers where he would play with the other children and see the direct impact of his mother's work. He didn't know the story of the man who had abandoned him, and Elena decided that when he was old enough, she would tell him the truth. Not out of bitterness, but as a lesson in character. She wanted him to know that his existence was never a mistake, even if the circumstances of his beginning were difficult. The 10th anniversary of the Sterling Foundation was celebrated with a gala that dwarfed all previous events. It was held in the very ballroom where Elena had once confronted Mark, but the atmosphere was entirely different. This wasn't a night of confrontation, it was a night of celebration. People from all over the world, former beneficiaries of the foundation who were now doctors, lawyers, and entrepreneurs, came to honor the woman who had given them a second chance. Elena stood on the stage looking out at the sea of faces. She didn't see subjects or employees. She saw a community of survivors. She saw her own reflection in every woman who had refused to give up. During her speech, Elena didn't mention Mark by name, but she spoke of the darkness that had once threatened to consume her. 10 years ago, I thought my life was over because someone I loved told me I was a burden. She said, her voice echoing with a powerful resonance. I believed the lie that my value was tied to someone else's approval, but I stand here tonight to tell you that your value is inherent. It cannot be taken away by betrayal, and it cannot be diminished by poverty. The person who walks away from you is not taking your future with them. They are simply making room for the people who are meant to be there. The standing ovation lasted for 5 minutes. In the front row, Julian held Leo's hand, both of them beaming with a pride that was visible to everyone in the room. After the speeches, Elena and Julian shared a dance. The world around them faded away as they moved to the music. "We did it," Julian whispered. "We did more than that," Elena replied. "We built something that will last longer than we will." She looked around the room and felt a deep soul-level peace. The pain of the past was no longer a wound. It was a scar, a reminder of a battle won. She realized that she didn't hate Mark anymore. Hate required energy, and she had none left for him. He was a non-entity, a shadow that had long since been dissipated by the light of her current life. She had achieved the ultimate revenge. She had forgotten him by becoming someone he could never comprehend. The night ended with the three of them, Elena, Julian, and Leo, walking out of the gala together. The paparazzi were there as always, but their flashes didn't feel intrusive. They were just documenting a reality that was too bright to be ignored. As they got into their car, Leo fell asleep against Julian's shoulder, his small hand tucked into Elena's. They drove through the city, passing the Sterling Heights building, where it had all begun. Elena looked at the top floor, the lights still burning bright. She remembered the girl with the mop and the aching back, and she whispered a silent thank you to her. Without that girl's grit, the woman she was today wouldn't exist. The story of Elena and Mark is a testament to the fact that our beginnings do not have to dictate our endings. Mark Woods eventually disappeared completely. Rumors suggested he moved to a small coastal town, working a menial job, living a life of quiet desperation and what-ifs. He became a man who lived in the past, forever haunted by the ghost of the woman he had underestimated. He had sought wealth without effort and love without sacrifice, and in the end he was left with neither. His name became a footnote in Elena's biography, a brief mention of a hurdle she had cleared on her way to greatness. Elena, on the other hand, continued to thrive. She and Julian grew old together, their love maturing like a fine wine. They became the patriarch and matriarch of a family that valued character over commerce. When Elena eventually retired, she passed the leadership of the foundation to Leo, who had grown into a man of immense integrity and vision. On her final day in the office, Elena stood on the balcony of the Sterling Heights building, looking out at the city she had helped transform. She felt a sense of completion that few ever experience. She had taken the broken pieces of a betrayed life and used them to build a cathedral of hope. The journey from the rainy apartment to the pinnacle of success was not easy, but it was necessary. It taught her that the greatest betrayal isn't when someone leaves you. It's when you leave yourself. By choosing to stay, by choosing to fight for herself, and her son Elena had claimed a life that was authentically hers. She had found a man who didn't just love her for her beauty or her success, but for the fire in her soul that could never be extinguished. As the sun set over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city, Elena smiled. She was no longer waiting for the dawn. She was the light. Her story is a reminder to everyone who feels lost or abandoned. The end of a relationship is not the end of your story. It is merely the end of a chapter. There are billionaire hearts out there, not just in terms of money, but in terms of kindness and support, waiting to recognize your worth. But more importantly, there is a version of you waiting to be discovered. A version that is stronger, wiser, and more beautiful than you can imagine. Don't let the shadows of the past dim the brilliance of your future. Like Elena, you can rise from the ashes and build a life that is truly spectacular. Thank you so much for following this emotional journey of betrayal and ultimate triumph. This story was written to remind us all that no matter how dark the night, the morning always comes for those who refuse to give up. We hope Elena's strength and Julian's unwavering support have inspired you today. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more content about resilience, love, and life transformations, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories like this to life. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.